Verse 19. For I am not laying the foundation for spiritual knowledge on earth. That must come after. For as Jehovah gave to man a corporeal life and then a spiritual life, so am I laying a foundation for a new race, the Gans, on earth. For from their kin shall spring the heirs of Cosmon, who shall embrace both corporeal and spiritual knowledge. Verse 20. But these shall rise in corporeal knowledge and go down in it, suffering death in that which I now reign on the earth. Verse 21. Ye shall teach them in truth, but they will in after generations contort your teachings into corporeal worship, prostrating themselves before the sun, moon, and stars, going down in disbelief, not in only spiritual life, but in the great spirit and his gods and lords. Verse 22. And these things must come to pass on the corporeal world, nor is there any resurrection in the later days, except these of this day go through the fall which I am preparing for them. Verse 23. For which reason ye shall find corporeal knowledge in the stars, and name them, for these things will be testimony in Cosmon of the fate of the worshippers of corporeal knowledge in the time of the Osirian cycle. So here it tells that Osiris is laying down the foundation of physical knowledge, the study of physical matter, and through his knowledge and after generations man will distort the essence of this knowledge and begin to prostrate and worship the sun, moon, and stars as the gods. In the book of Osiris, son of Jehovah, chapter 13, verse 7, it states, Osiris foresaw the times and places in the future road of the earth and heaven, and that from his decrees would spring corporeal philosophers, the first of the earth, whereto man should look back in after ages, saying, thence sprang the Osirian system, hence the Osirian race. Yet he looked further on when men should become adulterers in disbelief of spiritual things, doing worship to the sun, moon, and stars, and in very corporeal and in very corporal profess to find the cause and foundation of all things. So here Osiris predicts how his philosophy and lessons is going to affect the future generations of man on earth. What Osiris is laying down is the physical knowledge, science, astronomy, natural philosophy that will remain to the end of the world. Now we're going to move into the birth of the Shepherd kings, which is the same time period. As I left off in the last documentary referring to the 10 lost tribes that became lost coming back from their journeys of the lands of the east, and these 10 lost tribes occupied what is now called Iran, or ancient Persia. This would place the beginning of Persia at about 13,000 years ago. Now the birth of the Shepherd kings. The Lord's 5th book, chapter 3, verse 14 through 24, it states, Now in the midst of 3 great countries, Japheth, Shem, and Ham was the chief place of the Ahuans, where they founded a new nation, and the Lord called them Persia, signifying warrior faithist, because he created them as a shield to guard his chosen, the Ions. So here it states a new nation began in the lands called Persia, and the Lord names the Ahuans of that land Persian, meaning warrior faithist. They defended the sacred little people, the Ions, in the time of war, and this is about 12,000 years ago. Now verse 15. The difference between the Ahuans and the Persians was that the Ahuans lived near and about the Ions, but the Persians lived in a nation by themselves. Verse 16. Nevertheless, they were all of the same blood and kin, being half-breeds between the Ions and the native drunks. And they were large and mostly of color of new copper. And because they were favored of the Lord gave them separate laws, and commanded them not to mix with the drunks, the which commandment they kept for more than 1,000 years. But in course of time the Persians were tempted by the drunks and fell from their high estate, and then became cannibals. Verse 19. And the Lord sent the Gans, to whom he delivered his oral scriptures, to travel in search of his people. And lo and behold, 10 tribes of the Lord's people were lost in the wilderness, and this was the country of the Persians, and that land was filled with wild goats. Hence came the name Land of Goats. Verse 20. And the lost tribes, not being flesh eaters, were at a loss for food, and they said, Come, let us live on goat's milk. Verse 21. And they so lived for a long season, taming the goats and keeping herds of them. And they rove about driving their herds with them, for which reason they took the name Shepherd Kings. So here is where the name Shepherd King stemmed from. In verse 22, and the Lord looked on them with favor, saying, These that call themselves Shepherd Kings shall have this country. Behold, out of the seed of this people will I do a mighty wonder. Will I do mighty wonders? So here it states that out of the seed of these people, the Shepherd Kings, will I do mighty wonders. And it is through this seed that Abraham stems from. Now, verse 23, the Lord said, What man can discover, I, the Lord, left for him to discover. What man could not discover, I, the Lord, taught him. Verse 24, To the Shepherd Kings revealed I how to make leather out of skin. Neither had man any means to make this discovery. The Shepherd Kings made bags of leather in which they carried milk, which was thus churned, and they made butter, which was the first butter in the world. So here it states that the Shepherd Kings were the first to make leather in the world and the first to make butter, and the time period is around 12,000 years BC. Now in the book of Wars against Jehovah, chapter 21, verse 1 and 3, it states, Thus lay the three great countries, Arabia, Persia, and Hellas, of which Persia was mightiest, people with very giants, lofty bearing men and women, of red, copper colored, and with an abundance of long black hair, high in the nose and cheekbones, with determined jaws, and eyes to charm and command, mostly full-blooded Ahuans, half-breeded between the Ahuans and the burrowers in the ground, the brown people, dull and stupid. The Persians were a proud race, built up in great comeliness by the god Apollo, whose high raised office was to fashion the breeds of mortals into noble forms. Foremost in all the world was Persia in all great deeds, and in men of learning, and in ancient wars. It was here great Zarathustra was born and raised for Jehovah's voice and corporeal words. Here the first great city of the sun was built, Os, whose king aspired to rule all the world, and great riches amongst men were here first tolerated by the gods. So here it states Persia was the mightiest and the first to have a sun kingdom whose objective goal was to rule the world. And this would also be the first one world government, just as the world bankers are trying to do today. And this is 2 arc cycles before the time of Egypt, and the sun kings and the sun kingdoms of Egypt. And verse 3 states, And often these traveling hunters dwell with the sacred little people in the wilderness, the Ions, whom Jehovah had taught to charm even the great serpent, and savage lions and tigers to be their friends and worshippers. And herefrom sprang a people called Lycians, who lived mostly in the forest, went naked, to whom the Ions taught the secret of charming and secret hand power, who worship Jehovah, owning no man, no god as master, for which the Great Spirit named them Shepherd Kings. For they rule over flocks of goats, which supply them with milk and butter and cheese, and wool for crotch clothes, the only covering they wore. So here it shows that the Shepherd Kings lived in the forest and wore crotch clothing, and they ruled over goats and were taught by the Ahans, who lived in the forest as well. And these were the people in the land of Persia, the Ions and the Shepherd Kings, who lived in the forest, and the Persians who lived in the sun kingdoms, or the sun kingdoms and cities. Now in the Lord's 5th book, chapter 6, verse 25 through 35, it gives the function of the sun kingdom. It states, verse 25, The Lord established reciprocities between kings and queens in those days, and this was the manner thereof. Verse 26, The central kingdom was called the sun kingdom, and the others were called satellites. And the chief ruler was called the Sun King, or King of the Sun. Verse 27. And the king maintained an observatory for determining the times and seasons of the sun, moon, earth, and stars. The name of the observatory was called the Temple of Stars. Verse 28. The Lord said unto man, Build thou a chamber unto God within the temple of stars. Verse 29. And man so built it. And the Lord chose seers, one for every star chamber, And the seer sat therein with a table before him, on which table sand was sprinkled. And the Lord wrote in the sand with his finger the laws of heaven and earth. Verse 30. Thus gave God to man the names of the stars and their seasons, and the